Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you guys don't know me, my name is Kaylee and I'm here today to tell you all one of my infamous story times. You guys have been waiting for this one for way too long. I told another crazy neighbor story time a couple years back. I believe it was in 2020, maybe 2021, I don't fully remember. I mentioned in that video that I had a second neighbor story time that I needed to kind of collect my thoughts on and tell as well, and then I left you all hanging for a very long time. So today we are sitting down to film it. I'm so excited to finally tell you guys what happened, and if you are interested and haven't seen the other one, I'll link it below. They are not related, just starting off the bat. These are two totally different sets of neighbors because apparently Brandon and I just attract crazy neighbors. We finally live in a place where we really don't have neighbors, but this story takes place prior to my former story from our apartment, and it actually takes place way back in 2017. So I've been like collecting my thoughts and information, and I have a bunch of notes on my phone that I'm going to be referencing during this because this is a fairly long one. But this is the story of the first place we ever lived and the neighbors that live next door to us, and it was a party house and some really crazy things went down. This is that story, so enjoy. So like I was saying, 2017 is when the story takes place. However, we moved into the house in 2016. There's actually a full tour of it on my channel if you're interested. I'll link that below as well. If you want to just see the house and where we were living. But I want to set the scene a little bit for you so that you understand why this party house was such a problem in this neighborhood. Because we lived in this little development. The house we were renting was actually Brandon's cousin's house. He was renting it out to us temporarily. We weren't really sure how long we were going to be living there. Initially, it was probably going to be about a year, and we moved in November of 2016. There was an original development in the front of this neighborhood that they had extended back, and we lived in the newer extended part of the development. And our area was actually a loop. It was not a cul-de-sac. I want to make that clear. It was a big loop, and there were a lot of houses. They were all crammed in together, back to back in the middle of the loop, and then all along the outsides of the loop. Nobody really had fencing. There wasn't a whole lot of privacy. There were some trees, but it was like close quarters, okay? And this neighborhood was designed to be like full of starter homes, really affordable housing. This was 2017, so they were affordable back then. Everyone had like a little ranch or a little cape. Like none of the houses were really big. And the main demographic that lived there were older people who were like retirement age or young families like with little kids like 5 and under. So Brandon and I, honestly, we were very much out of the regular demographic moving into this place, but we kind of liked it because it was so quiet and peaceful and very low traffic, and there's just like, even though you were in close quarters to these other houses, it was relatively quiet, right? Like that's ideal. So when we moved in, Brandon's cousin did warn us that the neighbors to our left were problematic. They had been having issues with them for several years at this point. He had been living there, I think, for 5 years at the point that we moved in, and he said that they had been a problem consistently for the past at least 2 to 3 years, maybe more. The entire neighborhood had issues with them, and he himself had luckily not experienced anything too crazy with them aside from his mailbox getting smashed. And he had not seen that happen, but he was pretty sure that that was related to this house. So this house was situated to our left, like I said. It was not super far from us. We didn't have a fence or anything in between. Our driveway was a little more elevated from it, but pretty much wide open between us and them. There lived a mom and her 2 kids. So single mom and 2 kids. She had a son and a daughter. The daughter was a teenager, and the son I would put at about maybe 10, 11 years old. The daughter was the main culprit for the house parties. And at this point you might be wondering, how is this allowed to go on with the fact that like her mother lives there and it's her mother's house? Well, your guess is as good as mine. So they lived there. We were warned about this, that the daughter was notorious for throwing house parties. The police had been there multiple times in the past, and they apparently were not getting the picture. And basically we were told to watch out because sometimes these parties would get really rowdy and out of hand, and things like mailboxes getting smashed would happen. So we moved in November of 2016, and Brandon's cousin was not super worried about it. He was like, honestly, you probably won't have to worry much about them until the summer. She tends to throw house parties in the summer, so it's probably gonna be pretty quiet for the time being. We move in and pretty much forget about it because it was very quiet for the time being. It was the school year, they were both in school. We weren't really sure of their ages, but we knew that they both went to school. We later found out the daughter was 18, but we'll get there. We were living there, we were very happy. It was a really cute, perfect little size house for us. It was a good starter home. We were just happy as clams. It was great. Fast forward to the spring of 2017. We've been living there for a few months. We're pretty familiar with a lot of other people in the neighborhood, although we had not met these party house neighbors yet. Never had conversed with them, nothing. We had met the woman on the other side of them. Her name, I'm just gonna say it, her name was Joanne, and she was a retired aged lady, super nice, kind of the gossip of the neighborhood. But she had come over several times and just chatted it up with us. Super nice lady, would walk her dog around. And she had mentioned before about these neighbors as well, how they were problematic and basically just to watch out for them. So we're getting warned from all sides here by people oh, your neighbors, they're a problem. So it's the spring. I was often coming home early on Fridays. I was a contractor for my job at the time. I kind of made my own schedule, and I was always home early Fridays. That was very common for me to be home at 3, 4 o'clock. And I start noticing a pattern with the neighbors. Now you might be thinking this is a little bit stalkerish and why would I know what was going on with them? But the way that I've talked about this neighborhood, you might have guessed at this point that there was no traffic on our street. There was no traffic, there was no other activity. And so when there was something going on, it was immediately very noticeable. So if there were cars we didn't recognize, you would just pick up on things super easy. And so one of the things that I picked up on was that every single Friday, right around 3, 4 o'clock, the mom next door would take the son and leave the house and leave the daughter home. And she wouldn't return until late Sunday afternoon. And this was every single weekend from April on. Of course, that is why her daughter would feel so comfortable throwing house parties, because she was being left home alone literally every single weekend. I'm just gonna leave that at that because clearly this is a problem. As you're about to hear about, it was a problem. I don't know why the mom thought this was okay, and I don't know where she was going. Maybe she had to leave, I don't know. We're not going to dwell too much on that. Bottom line is, she would leave every single Friday with the son, and they would not return until Sunday, leaving the entire weekend wide open for her daughter to proceed to have raging house parties. It started out fairly quiet. So she had the daughter, we'll call the daughter Mary. Mary had a core group of friends that were at the house all the time. They would always be over there during the week. We would see them outside, out on the front porch. They were just a core group of friends. And then she also had a boyfriend that we saw all the time as well, and figured it was a boyfriend just by the way they interacted. So it started out with her just having them over. They would normally be over Friday and Saturday nights. And on Saturdays, we would notice sometimes the occasional extra couple cars. So she'd have, a few more people over, but nothing crazy. And I remember thinking oh, this isn't even a problem. Why is the whole neighborhood freaking out about this? This is not that big a deal. Brandon and I were 23 years old at the time, so we were very much still in the going out stage and the partying stage, and kind of fresh out of college, and that type of thing just didn't really faze me back then. Noise complaints and stuff wasn't something that I would do because I've been there, I've been that age and gone to house parties and stuff, and so I wasn't the type to be I'm gonna rat these people out every time they have friends over. No. And I really didn't think that it warranted that at the time. So she's having more and more people over every single weekend. We would notice The influx of people became greater and greater as time went on. There was one night that I was woken up at like 3 or 4 in the morning by them all outside. They were very loud, screaming in their backyard. Luckily, our room was on the other side of the house, away from their house. So for us, unless we had the windows wide open, which it was the summer, so sometimes we did, we wouldn't really hear it, but I would hear it on occasion. Not to the point that it was keeping me up all night or anything. Like, it was just, we would hear them getting kind of rowdy in the backyard. One night I woke up to a bunch of blue lights like flashing throughout our house, and it was the police breaking up whatever gathering she was having at the time. And after that, she seemingly stopped having people over, and things went quiet the next couple weekends. So one night shortly after this, Brandon decides he's gonna go get us late night McDonald's. This was on a Saturday night. He left probably around like 10 o'clock to go get McDonald's, and of course had to drive through the front part of the neighborhood and like out of the development basically to get out of it. He comes back and he's laughing, and I'm like, what are you laughing at? And he goes, so I'm pretty sure our neighbor is having her friends now park in the front part of the development, like away from our area, and then walk into her house because there's a bunch of cars just parked along the road in the upper development. Sure enough, we were seeing kids walking in with bags and stuff to this house over the next couple weekends. So she had started parking them away from the house in order to deter the cops from coming over, because the cops would do drive-bys, but if there was nobody visibly at the house, there wasn't really much that they could do. The night that they had gotten caught and like the party had gotten broken up, there had been cars all over the place, like in front of the house and everything. So she was getting very crafty with how she was executing her parties. Eventually, Joanne, the neighbor on the other side, had come over to talk to us one day because we were outside doing yard work, and she was like, hey, I don't want to bug you guys about this, but have you guys been hearing all of the partying that's been going on at the house next door? I'm getting woken up constantly by it. Her bedroom was on like the side closest to their house and her house, and she was telling us how like it was every single weekend, and she had called in a couple of noise complaints and basically been told, you know, we have a cop driving through, but if there's no discernible people at this house, like there's not really much we can do. And also like we need to receive multiple calls in order to warrant like them investigating it. And so I guess she was like one of the only people calling at that point, and was like, if you guys hear anything like super loud that wakes you up, is there any way you can just like simply call in a noise complaint, just so they know I'm not overreacting and that there's actually like big parties going on next door? Because apparently the police had just like stopped believing her, because now the kids were parking elsewhere and walking in. She was a really sweet old lady, and we were like, yeah, you know, if we see anything crazy, we'll definitely alert the police. You know, we haven't been bothered by it yet, but if we see something, we'll absolutely do something about it. And she was like, thank you so much. You know, I've been dealing with this for years. I've lived here for like, you know, 6-7 years at this point. And she goes, you know, these people have always been a problem, and for some reason they just don't learn, and this is just really not the neighborhood to have this big party house in the middle of. And we were like, we totally get it, and we'll keep an eye out. The following week from that conversation with her was when everything hits the fan. So Mary, the daughter, middle of the week, we're making dinner, and we have windows open because it's like July at this point. We have windows open, and we can hear her having an absolute blowout, knockdown, drag-out fight in the middle of her driveway next door with her boyfriend. And they are clearly breaking up, like very obviously breaking up. Brandon and I are both like making dinner, but also kind of like, you know, being a little nosy because it's like literally happening right outside the window. And it ends with him getting in his truck and peeling out down the road. Now, he drove this big lifted truck that had dual diesel smokestacks on the back of it, and it was obnoxiously loud. Like, you could hear him coming from a mile away when he would show up, you know, to see her all the time. And he peels out, And we're like, okay, well, they just broke up. Like, that's interesting. We carry on with our day. And then a couple of nights later, this is literally like a Wednesday, okay? We're like in the middle of the week. It's 10 p.m. We're wrapping up watching TV, preparing to go to bed, and we hear him coming down the road. And he was ripping his truck up and down the road, burning his tires in front of the house. The diesel smokestacks are like shooting black smoke into our house, just acting obnoxious. We're pretty sure he was like retaliating over the fact that they had broken up and was trying to make her mad. And she had come out and was standing in her driveway like screaming at him to leave. And he just continued to like rip up and down the road at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday in the middle of this neighborhood. And it was obnoxious. And so we didn't call the police on him for that, but I would not be surprised if somebody did because it was ridiculous. But yeah, so that happened in the week that the climax of the story also happened. So that was the precursor to the storm that was coming. So that following weekend, Brandon and I went out to dinner. It was a Saturday night. I remember we got home probably around like 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and we pull in the driveway and we see that she just had like a friend over or something, like one of their usual SUVs was there. It was pretty quiet. Like, we didn't really think much of it. We were like, all right, let's watch a movie. We put a movie on. It's like right around 10 o'clock. And we start noticing a influx of traffic coming down the road. Again, this was very easy to pick up on because it was so quiet, and we start seeing all of these SUVs pulling up outside of the neighbor's house, and they are literally dumping like clown car style, like 10 kids out of each car, all of them carrying backpacks, bags, clearly bringing in some booze. And we notice instantly that the difference between past parties and like things she's done and this night was that the people that were getting out of these cars were very, very young. They all looked super duper young. Never had I seen people this young at her house. She, like I said, we later find out is 18, and she looked 18, 18, 19 years old. We were not sure 100% of her age, but we knew she was on the older end of teenage years. These kids were definitely much, much younger than that. And so that was the first weird thing. And the other weird thing was just how many of them were showing up at this house at 10 o'clock at night. There were some walking in from having parked at the front of the development. We can hear bottles clanging like in their bags. We knew that they were all going there to have some big raging party. And we were like, oh, like this is a lot of people. It was easily the most people that we'd ever seen going to this house. Brandon and I decide we're gonna turn off our lights in our house because after the story about the mailbox getting smashed, we were very paranoid that if we had to call the police on these people, that they would retaliate and do some kind of vandalism to our house. That was the initial reason that his cousin had thought that his mailbox got smashed, was that they suspected he had called the police on them. So we decide we just black out the house. We shut off all the lights and we act like we've gone to bed so that if we do have to call, they're not gonna necessarily be looking at us. And so then we're just kind of sitting in the living room and it's dark and we're just kind of hanging out and talking and whatever. So some time goes by and we can definitely hear like the party next door and we're like, okay, like, but it's not crazy loud. Nothing's really out of control. We're not gonna call, like this doesn't really warrant a phone call to the police. Like, we're not gonna bug them. We're just not gonna do it. So right around probably 11:30, we hear the door open and we hear a group of these party goers come out of the house, and we see them all walk in front of our house, and they actually come up onto our lawn. A lot of them had glass bottles and they were like out in the road. One of them smashed one of the glass bottles in the road, and then we had like maybe 4 or 5 of them just like loitering on the bottom of our lawn, really obviously very drunk and just wandering around on our property. And so, or Brandon's cousin's property, I should say. And so at this point, we both kind of look at each other and we're like, okay, we'll call, give the cops a heads up. They're obviously very drunk. We're not going to mess with them. Like, we're not gonna like start anything between us and them. They're obviously not in their right mindset. They're like on our yard. I don't even know if they realize they are. We'll just give the cops a call and give them a heads up that this is going on next door and that they're on our property. And so we do that. The dispatcher is like, thank you for not saying anything to them. Like, do not engage with them. It's sounding like they're all pretty drunk. And we said yes. And they also appear to be very underage. And she was like, okay, I'm gonna send out units. It's probably gonna take like 30 minutes. And we're like, cool. We then sit down to wait. And eventually they leave our lawn and wander off down the road. I don't know what became of them to this day. Don't know what became of that group, but they were all outside and then they left. And we were like, oh, it's just gonna be like always. The cops are gonna drive by. They're not gonna see anybody. They're not gonna see cars because everyone got dropped off. And they're just gonna leave. And this stuff is just gonna keep going in circles, and that's really annoying, but nothing we can really do. Like 45 minutes goes by and the cops are not there. So we're like, they're probably not gonna show up at this point. Let's just go to bed. It was relatively quiet. We could hear the party next door, but it was not to the point that it was gonna like keep us awake. So we decide going to bed, and Brandon is like, I'm going to actually go out and put the garden lights on. So we had these like low little garden lights, and he was like, I'm thinking maybe that might deter them from coming up onto the yard if there's like a light on. We had a porch light too, and I can't remember why it wasn't on. I think he was going to turn that on too. And he steps out onto our little front porch to do that. And I just see him pause on the porch, and then he slowly backs into the house and shuts the door very quietly and turns and looks at me and says, the cops are here. And I'm like looking out the window at the neighbors, and I'm like, no, they're not. There's like nobody there. And he said, no, the cops are here. And as he puts emphasis on here, I see 3 officers walking through my front yard. Stealth mode. We're like, oh my God, they're on foot. They've never done this before. What the heck is going on? So we immediately like go sit in the window and are watching, because who wouldn't at this point? This is escalating very quickly. And so 2 of the officers are walking up to the front door of the neighbor's house, and the 3rd goes around into the backyard. Remember this for later. So they walk up to the house, and as they're about to knock on the door, one of Mary's good friends, who we saw all the time at this house, one of her guy friends, walks out onto the porch right into the cops, like literally walks almost into them, and they announce themselves, and he's obviously very caught off guard. He, I'm assuming, was going out to smoke or something. We saw him smoking out on the porch all the time, and they're like, we're looking for Mary, can you please go get her? And he's like, yep, 1 second, and goes back in the house, and the cops are just waiting on the front porch. Like 10 minutes goes by, nobody's coming out. And then the door opens again, and another of Mary's friends, this time a girl, steps out onto the porch, walks straight into them again, clearly had no idea they were there, catches her off guard, and they once again say, is Mary here? We need to talk to her. And she's like, yeah, let me get her, and goes back in. And this time she comes back with Mary. Now, Mary is barely standing because of how intoxicated she is at this point. And they know her by name, obviously. And they start to talk to her on the porch, and they're like, hey, basically, we know you're having a party. We've had multiple people call with noise complaints saying you've got kids in your house and outside and on people's property. We need you to get them all to leave, and we need to talk because this like keeps continuing. The way they were talking to her was like they knew her personally, which says a lot about this whole situation, like how often this girl was getting caught by police having big house parties. She proceeds to completely deny that anybody is at her house. Says, everyone that called you is a liar. There's nobody here. I have my 2 friends here. We're the only people here. And they were like, we know there are more people here. Like, we know. People have seen that there are more people here. we are well aware that there's a bunch of people in your house right now. She continues to keep denying it. They ask her how much she's had to drink. And at first she was like, I've only had 3 beers. And then that's the point where they were like, you're 18, you're not even supposed to be drinking at all. They go back and forth for another like probably 20 minutes about the fact that they know she's having a party and she is completely denying it. So eventually they're like, we're just gonna call your mom and we're gonna get permission to come in the house, because it was her mother's house, obviously. And she, at this point, starts to panic and go into a full-blown meltdown, to the point that she is screaming, blocking the door, has like sat herself down on the porch and refuses to move from in front of the door. She's grabbing at the officers and they're like, we're just gonna go give your mom a call. One of them walks away. Brandon and I at this point couldn't believe how much this had escalated in such a short time. Like, we did not expect this at all. We thought that they would break up the party and leave, but she was putting up a fight, like a serious fight. Her friends were like, just cooperate with them, like just cooperate, like you're gonna end up getting arrested. And she was wailing and screaming and inconsolable. And so the other police officer comes back with her mom on speakerphone on his phone, and she's verbally giving permission for them to go into the house. And upon this, Mary starts to grab at the officers even more, like she's trying to block them, prevent them from walking in the door. They start to warn her that they're gonna have to detain her if she doesn't stop. During the course of all this, also had changed the number of drinks she had had multiple times. We knew she was probably pretty blackout drunk at this point. Eventually, the cops are like telling her friends, like, we're sorry, but we're gonna have to detain her in the car. Like, we can't allow this. Like, she was literally throwing herself at them, blocking them, grabbing at them. They detain her as she's kicking and screaming, and get her in this cop car that's now parked in the driveway. Because during all this, they had driven their police cruisers in to the driveway. Like, they had been parked at the front of the development, like she had people do. They had parked, and then they were all kind of converging on the house as this was all going on. She's screaming, there's nobody in the house, there's nobody in the house. In the process of this, one of the kids that was in the house attempts to run out of the walkout basement and proceeds to run smack into the officer that's in the backyard, who then grabs him. He's screaming, everyone's screaming. It's chaos. I can only imagine being the neighbors right behind them, or even Joanne at this point, because they were all much closer to this house than we were. We were kind of up on a hill. The noise level and just like the chaos that was happening all at once was just not what we were expecting to happen. They get Mary into the cruiser, and the second they get her in the cruiser, she starts to smash her face against the cage in the back of the cruiser. Violently smashing her face. Smashing her head against the window. The cruiser is visibly shaking because she's throwing herself around so violently in the cruiser. Her friends are mortified. They're screaming for her to stop. They're begging for her to stop. They're literally like so embarrassed. You can just tell how embarrassed they are. And they're like, this is not worth it. Like, stop, please stop doing this. Like, it's gonna be okay. They're gonna arrest you. At that point, she wasn't technically under arrest, but she was gonna be. Okay, so my camera died, so if this looks a little different, it's because I'm now filming on my phone. But yeah, so she's in the police cruiser. She is smashing her face against the cage. We are standing in the window of our living room watching this go down, like with our jaws on the floor, because it was just escalating so fast. And so after, a few minutes, the police have gone in the house at this point. There are several police cruisers out front now. They've got spotlights on the house. It was a whole deal. They start to pull kids out of this house. One of the first people, actually, backtracking, one of the first people that they actually pulled out was a man who looked to be in his 30s. Handcuffed, definitely under arrest. And they're walking him out to one of the police cruisers, and he's screaming over his shoulder to his friend to bail him out. I don't know what was going on with that because, like I said, the majority of the other people in this house were very much underage, and we were about to find out just how underage they were. So for reference, Mary was 18. This guy that just got pulled out of the house was like probably in his early 30s. The kids they were pulling out of this house were like 13, 14, 15 years old. And we knew this because they were pulling them out, putting them on the porch, and like separating them by who's a minor, who's not a minor. They were asking them how old they were, who was drunk, who wasn't drunk. The non-drunk kids were on the front lawn. The drunk kids were on the porch. And meanwhile, Mary is still screaming and shaking the police cruiser in the driveway. They eventually arrested her and took her away. They told her friends, like, we're taking her to the station. You can bail her out and get her in the morning. And then they had to sort out all of these kids, which there were dozens of kids just on the front lawn, calling parents. Parents were coming to pick them up. And that is where we kind of left that whole situation because it was late, first of all. Brandon had to work the next day. And second of all, everything started to kind of calm down. But then the next morning, they brought Mary home. The friends had went and gotten her, I guess. They showed up at like, I think it was like 11 in the morning. I saw the car pull in and I had texted Brandon who was at work and I was like, oh, you know, she's back, she's home. And so they had brought her home, and then shortly after that, her mother got home. One would have thought that she would have done something about this situation, but we're pretty sure she didn't, because later on in the day, we came home from dinner that night and she was on the front lawn on the phone with someone screaming about how nobody was going to tell her how to parent her child and that she was going to deal with things how she wanted. And my only assumption is that that meant she did absolutely nothing about the situation, even though her daughter was literally like the disruption of the neighborhood. That's all I'm gonna say about the mom, because it gets worse. So we moved 2 months after this. We ended up moving out, and then later on we ended up getting our apartment that you guys all probably know from my other videos that we lived in for like 4 years. So this was the place right before it. But yeah, so we ended up getting our apartment and stuff. We moved out in the fall of 2017. And the morning that we moved out, the night before had been the first time that Mary had thrown another party since the incident back in like July. Because yes, believe it or not, she decided to continue this despite what had happened and the warnings and everything that had happened, and clearly how the neighborhood wasn't putting up with it anymore. She continued and threw a party the night before we moved out, which of course we at that point were like, we're leaving, we're not bothering with this. We woke up the next morning on our moving day to sirens coming through our neighborhood. It was an ambulance, and apparently someone had either OD'd or gotten alcohol poisoning next door because they were there to pick up someone. We did see them come out of the house and they were walking, so they were like conscious. But then we collectively realized that the son, the 10-year-old, was there and had been left alone with the daughter for the weekend. Apparently the mother had left without him, and this had all transpired while he was there. And that was the point where I was like, I'm so glad we're leaving. This is just clearly, there's no end in sight to this situation. Until the daughter leaves and like moves out of her mother's house, like there's no end in sight. So yeah, we moved, and Brandon's cousin eventually moved back into that house and still lives there to this day. And as far as I know, there's like not really anything that has transpired since, although I'm not sure because we haven't really asked him about it. I'm sure the daughter, she's much older now, probably eventually moved out, I would think. Maybe the son still lives there. But yeah, there was no resolution to all the crazy partying that was going on at that house. It just continued on even after we left. And that was that. So that's the story. It's not anything crazy to do directly with Brandon and I. I mean, we were kind of involved, but a lot of it was just like a bystander story of like what we saw. I can't believe to this day that like the mother was allowing her child to use her house as like essentially like a party house. And like, I don't know how the mother wasn't getting in trouble, like supplying like a place for underage kids to party. I don't know how any of that was working out. I don't know how they weren't getting charged. Maybe they were, but I'm glad to not live next door to them anymore. So that's it, guys. That's it for the story. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this one. If you like this story and my other story times, make sure you give this one a thumbs up and go check out the playlist. There's a whole playlist on my channel of story times throughout the years if you are interested in this type of video for you to enjoy. I do have another story time lined up to film, though I haven't yet, and I'm not giving you guys any kind of date as to when that's coming out because, as we know, I don't adhere to them very well. This one took forever to film and get out there. So there is another one in the works. It'll be in a future video. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.